The Office of Personnel Management has new guidance for agency leaders to develop flexible telework policies. OPM recommends managers make most telework decisions based on job function and not managerial preference. Jeff Neal is former Chief Human Capital Officer at the Department of Homeland Security. Thanks for joining me, Jeff. What are agency officials thinking about as they prepare these new policies?
Well, I think there are a lot of things. Number one is they're going to have some tension between people who want to telework and some of the managers who really didn't like telework before the pandemic and don't like it now. So you're going to have these opposing forces in agencies trying to decide how much telework is appropriate. Should people be allowed to telework full time or even work remotely? Which is a different thing. And so they're going to be looking at that. They're going to have to look at what kind of technology they need to support telework. One of the things we learned in the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey was employees thought they needed better tech support for telework than they got. So those are some things that they're going to have to look at, which means you're going to have a partnership between managers in the agency and their HR folks and their CIO's office.
I assume there are some real lessons learned about both telework and remote work during the pandemic. What do you think are kind of the primary takeaways here on the side of managers and of employees?
Well, the biggest one on the side of the employees who want to telework is that a lot of people had been told for years they couldn't telework, that their jobs weren't appropriate for it. And then when the pandemic hit, managers went to those same employees and said, "Well, we need you to telework." And obviously, it was probably kind of a shock for some employees to be told, now you have to telework when they were told before, well, your job's not appropriate for telework. So I think we learned that telework is appropriate for far more jobs than we ever thought before. And the people who've been opposing telework, for the most part, have had the rug pulled out from under them because we proved that telework worked in a great many cases. What we did find is that there are some employees who struggled with telework, who either didn't have a good setup at home for working at home, or they just didn't have the discipline to work at home by themselves. So that was a problem for some folks. They found that for some jobs, it just doesn't work as well as they had hoped because people needed to interact more, or they needed information. For example, if you needed access to top secret information, you couldn't get that at home because you can't take top secret information home with you. So there are things like that that I think people learn. I think a lot of managers learn, though, that they could make it work, that it will require different management skills on their part. That what you do when you can just walk down the hall and talk to somebody is different from how you manage when you've got somebody who's working at home and you can't just pop in on them very easily. So there's some things that they're going to have to learn that are different, and they're going to have to learn how to do performance management better because they didn't do performance management particularly well before the pandemic, and I think the pandemic and the increased telework and remote work just makes it more difficult to handle that.
You distinguish between telework and remote work. What is the difference there? Can you walk us through?
Sure. The big difference is that telework is either recurring telework where you're doing it on a regular basis, or it's situational telework where you might work from home for 2 days to work on a project, and then the next time you want to work from home, you ask your boss again, "Can I work from home?" Regular or recurring telework is telework where an employee might work from home, say 3 days a week, and be in the office a couple days a week. So that's a little different from the situational type of telework. And then remote work is something where the employee is really not expected to come into the office at all. So I could have an office that's in Washington, D.C., and I could be working in Boise, Idaho, and that's fine. They don't expect me to come to Washington, D.C. And so telework is remote work is telework taken to the extreme. So it's don't have to work in town where the office is. Don't ever have to come in except maybe once a year you go to a meeting or something in town. So it's a little different. Telework's got enough complexities that OPM has actually said they're going to put out a guide on, or excuse me, remote work. They're going to put out a guide on remote work because there are so many questions that people have about it. But I do think that remote work is going to be something we're going to see more and more of. And it's probably going to be something that a lot of agencies end up using as a recruiting tool. if I can advertise a job and say, well, you can work in, any state in the union, it makes it a lot more appealing to some people than saying, okay, we've got a job for you, and take that job, you have to move to Boston, or you have to move to DC, or you have to move to Topeka. So I think we're going to see remote work growing, and I think we're also going to see that it becomes a very effective recruiting tool for the government.
And Jeff, as federal leaders are thinking about, what a return to work looks like, do you think these new rules relating to vaccination or testing changes that at all?
Well, I think you'd probably find that most federal employees, at least the majority, have been vaccinated already. So that's a very good thing. I do think we're going to find tension continuing on the pandemic and on vaccinations and how that's handled. We've had the president's policy put out, which I think was extremely reasonable policy. Some of the unions are saying, well, we don't want it implemented until we bargain over it, which I think is is a mistake on their part. I mean, they're really putting the institutional interests of the unions ahead of their own workforce, I think, in those cases. So I think we're going to continue to see some tension related to the pandemic and vaccination, mainly because what should clearly be a public health question and should have public health solutions has turned into a political issue. And we know when you turn something into a political issue, reason goes out the window, and people you know, kind of move off into their various tribes and start fighting with one another. So I would like to see that go away. I'd love to see people just deal with this as a public health emergency, which it is. But I'm not optimistic we're going to see that anytime soon.
Thanks for joining me, Jeff.
Happy to be here.